Do you even know where you are, old man? The voice was sharp, laced with the kind of impatient authority that expected immediate compliance. Commander Thorne, his jaw tight and his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the vast empty blue of the sky, took a half-step closer. He was the picture of modern naval command, his uniform starched to a razor's edge, every line on his face a testament to his rigid control over this floating steel city. Stanley Morton, 86 years old, did not turn. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, rested gently on the safety railing of the flight deck. He seemed infinitely more interested in the way the wind whipped across the gray, non-skid surface, a scent of salt and jet fuel that was as familiar to him as his own name. He wore a simple windbreaker, faded jeans and a baseball cap with a long-forgotten squadron insignia on it, the threads worn nearly smooth. He was a whisper of the past on a deck that screamed of the future. Thorne exchanged a look with the petty officer at his side, a silent communication of shared annoyance. This was a tiger cruise, a day for families and approved guests, but in Thorne's view, it was a liability, and this old man who had somehow wandered away from the designated tour area was the biggest liability of all. "Sir, I am speaking to you," Thorne said, his voice louder now, cutting through the low whine of the ship's systems and the distant roar of a fighter jet being tested on the catapult. "This is a restricted area. I need you to show me your guest credentials and return to the hangar bay immediately." Stanley finally turned, his movements slow and deliberate. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a placid depth that seemed to absorb Thorne's aggression without reflecting any of it back. He didn't seem intimidated or confused. He seemed observant. "It's a beautiful ship, Commander," Stanley said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "The launch and recovery systems are a world away from what we had." Thorne's patience, already a finite resource, snapped. He saw the comment not as an observation, but as a doddering old man's attempt to deflect. It was a waste of his valuable time. The deck was a meticulously choreographed ballet of immense power and danger, and this man was an uninvited disruption. "I don't have time for a history lesson," Thorne snapped. "Credentials. Now, or I'll have you confined to quarters for the remainder of the cruise." This isn't a retirement home promenade. The public nature of the rebuke was not lost on the small crowd of other guests and off-duty sailors who had begun to notice the confrontation. They kept their distance, but their phones were discreetly emerging. The sight of the ship's formidable air boss dressing down a frail-looking senior citizen was a spectacle. Stanley reached into his windbreaker, his hand moving with an economy of motion that belied his age. He didn't produce a guest lanyard or a plastic ID card. Instead, he pulled out a worn leather wallet, cracked and softened by decades of use. He fumbled with it for a moment, his fingers not as nimble as they once were. Thorne let out an exasperated sigh, a theatrical display for the benefit of his subordinates. "Let me guess, you've got your senior discount card in there. That's not going to work here. This is the United States Navy, not a matinee movie." A few of the younger sailors snickered. The humiliation was thick in the air, a palpable thing that made some of the civilian guests shift uncomfortably. Stanley ignored the jibe, finally extracting a thin yellowed card from a sleeve in the wallet. It was an old military ID, the photo showing a lean, dark-haired young man with the same calm eyes but a fire burning within them. The laminate was peeling at the corners. Thorne snatched it from his hand. He glanced at it, his lip curling in a smirk. "Stanley Morton, expired 1975. This is worthless. This is a piece of paper." He held it up between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a dead insect. "You are a civilian on my deck in an unauthorized area without proper identification. You are a security risk." Every word was a hammer blow, designed to belittle and dismiss. The commander was asserting his dominance not just over Stanley, but over the entire concept of someone like Stanley daring to occupy his space. He saw a frail, forgetful old man, a relic who didn't understand the rules of the modern world. He didn't see the man who had written half those rules in blood and bravery. "Petty officer," Thorne commanded, his voice ringing with finality. "Escort Mr. Morton below. Find his family sponsor. I want him off my flight deck for the rest of the day. Make sure he understands that." "Aye, Commander," the young sailor said, his face a mask of neutrality, though his eyes darted toward Stanley with a flicker of sympathy. He gently touched Stanley's elbow. "Sir, if you'll come with me." Stanley didn't resist. He gave one last look at the open sky, a look of profound and quiet longing. As he turned to go, his hand slipped back into his pocket, his fingers closing around a small, heavy object. It was a brass compass, no bigger than a silver dollar, its surface tarnished and dark from the passage of time. For a fleeting second, the bright, clear day on the carrier's deck dissolved. The scent of salt and fuel was replaced by the smell of ozone and terror. The steady hum of the ship became the violent percussive roar of a struggling engine and the shriek of a typhoon's wind. The deck under his feet was no longer a vast, stable runway, but the pitching, slick floor of a Sikorsky H-34's cabin, lit only by the frantic red glow of the instrument panel and the blinding white flashes of lightning outside. A younger Stanley Morton was there, his knuckles white as he gripped that very same compass, its needle spinning wildly, useless in the magnetic chaos of the storm. He wasn't looking at the needle, though. He was looking out into the churning black water, searching for a life that everyone else had already written off as lost. From 30 yards away, Lieutenant Marcus Thorne, no relation to the commander, watched the entire scene unfold with a knot tightening in his stomach. He was a junior flight officer, young but perceptive. He had been overseeing a pre-flight check on a nearby Hornet when his namesake's loud, arrogant voice had drawn his attention. He saw the way the old man stood, the way he absorbed the verbal barrage without flinching. It wasn't the posture of a confused tourist. It was the quiet stoicism of a man who had faced down far worse than an egotistical commander. He'd also seen the ID card, just a glimpse of it. Morton, Stanley Morton. The name rang a distant bell, a name he'd read in a dusty training manual or heard in a hushed story from an old instructor at Pensacola. A legend's name. As the petty officer led Stanley toward the hatch leading below deck, Marcus knew he couldn't let it stand. This was more than just a breach of decorum. It felt like sacrilege. Commander Thorne's ambition was well known on the ship. He saw rules not as guidelines for safety but as rungs on a ladder to his next promotion. He tolerated no deviation, and he had the political savvy to bury anyone who crossed him. Going over his head was a career-ending move. Marcus didn't care. He ducked behind the fuselage of the FA-18, pulling his satellite phone from a pouch on his flight vest. Standard protocols be damned. He wasn't calling the ship's bridge. He was calling a direct line he had been given once, and told to use only in the gravest of emergencies. He dialed the number for the duty captain at Naval Air Station North Island. The phone was answered on the second ring. Operations. Sir, this is Lieutenant Marcus Thorne on the USS Ronald Reagan, Marcus said, keeping his voice low. I have a situation here. It's delicate. What is it, Lieutenant? The voice on the other end was clipped, professional. There's a civilian on board, a guest for the Tiger cruise. His name is Stanley Morton. Commander David Thorne, the air boss, just had him publicly humiliated and removed from the flight deck. There was a pause on the other end. Say that name again, Lieutenant. Morton, sir. Stanley Morton. He looks to be in his late 80s, carries an old ID from the 70s. The silence on the line was now heavy, charged with a sudden palpable energy. Marcus could hear the faint sound of a chair scraping back and a muffled voice shouting away from the phone. When the duty captain spoke again, his voice was completely different. It was stripped of all casual professionalism, replaced by a tone of stunning, ice-cold urgency. Lieutenant Thorne, where is Mr. Morton right now? He's being escorted below deck, sir. To the guest observation area. Keep an eye on him. Do not let him out of your sight. Do you understand me? Sir? Just do it, Lieutenant. Help is on the way. The line went dead. Inside the sprawling operations center at NAS North Island, the duty captain, a man named Reynolds, slammed the phone down. Get me Admiral Vance now, he roared at a nearby communications tech. And get me the CO of HSC-8, the Night Witches. Tell him to spool up a bird for immediate launch. Priority 1. The tech stared, bewildered. Sir, what's the nature of the mission? The nature of the mission, Reynolds said, running a hand through his hair, his face pale, is that Commander Thorne on the Reagan has apparently lost his goddamn mind. Stanley Morton is on that ship. The name fell into the room like a thunderclap. A few of the older Master Chiefs froze, their heads snapping up from their consoles. Admiral Vance, a stern gray-haired man who had been overseeing a drill in a glass-walled conference room, burst out onto the floor, his phone already pressed to his ear. Reynolds, what in God's name did I just hear? Vance demanded. It's true, Admiral. The ghost is on the Reagan, and Thorne is treating him like a lost tourist. The Admiral's face, a mask of hard-won authority, seemed to crumble for a second, replaced by something that looked like horrified reverence. The ghost. My God, my father flew with him. He said Stanley Morton could find a needle in a hurricane with a child's compass and a prayer. Vance's eyes hardened. Get that Seahawk in the air. I don't care what flight schedules you have to burn. Tell the pilot their orders are to land on that deck with or without Thorne's permission. They are to retrieve a living legend. Make it happen. Now. The entire command center, a place accustomed to measured, calm procedure, was now a whirlwind of frantic, purposeful activity, all of it revolving around a name, a myth, a man who was at that moment sitting quietly on a bench in a crowded observation lounge, staring out a porthole at the sea. Back on the flight deck of the Reagan, Commander Thorne was basking in the afterglow of his re-established authority. The small incident had served its purpose perfectly. The deck crew was moving with renewed snap and vigor. The civilian guests were huddled in their designated zones, their eyes wide with a fresh appreciation for the seriousness of his domain. He was giving a small, impromptu speech to a group of VIPs, his voice carrying over the wind. "Discipline is the bedrock of naval aviation," he proclaimed, gesturing at the complex tapestry of men and machines around him. "Every rule, every protocol is written in blood. There is no room for sentimentality here. There is no place for those who cannot or will not follow orders. We must be vigilant against any disruption, no matter how seemingly benign. You have to know when to put the relics back in the museum case where they belong." He was just hitting his stride when the sound reached him. It was a sound he knew intimately, but it was wrong. It was the rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades, but it wasn't one of his own Seahawks spooling up. This was coming from outside, approaching fast. His head snapped up. An SH-60 Seahawk, painted with the distinctive markings of the HSC-8 Night Witches, was banking hard, coming straight for the carrier. It hadn't radioed for clearance. It hadn't entered the established landing pattern. It was behaving like an emergency medevac, but its movements were too precise, too arrogant. "What the hell is that?" Thorne snarled into his headset. "Tower, who is this bird? I did not authorize any landing." The reply was frantic. "Negative, Air Boss. They are not responding to hails. They're squawking a priority code we can't override. Wave them off," Thorne screamed, his face turning a blotchy red. "Get the landing signal officers out there and wave them off now. That is a direct order." But the LSOs, who had started to move, suddenly stopped and looked at each other in confusion. The Seahawk wasn't slowing or wavering. It continued its descent with the kind of flawless, rock-steady precision that spoke of a pilot with thousands of hours of experience. It ignored the frantic signals, the radio calls, the incandescent fury of the air boss. With a final gentle drop, its wheels kissed the deck, the rotor wash blasting across the stunned crowd. It settled into place as if it owned the ship. Commander Thorne was already stalking toward the helicopter before the engines had even begun to spool down, his face a thunderous mask of rage. He was ready to personally drag the pilot out and strip him of his wings for this breathtaking act of insubordination. The side door slid open. A man in his late 30s, wearing a full flight suit and helmet, hopped down to the deck. His uniform bore the rank of a commander, the same as Thorne, but his demeanor was a universe apart. He was the squadron commander of the Night Witches. He pulled off his helmet, his eyes scanning the deck with burning intensity. He completely ignored Thorne, who had stormed up to him, sputtering with rage. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" Thorne began, but the pilot's gaze swept right past him, searching, until it landed on Lieutenant Marcus Thorne, who was standing near the hatch. Marcus pointed down. The pilot nodded, a gesture of profound thanks. He then looked at the petty officer who had escorted Stanley away. "Sailor, go below and find a man named Stanley Morton. Tell him Commander Price is here to see him and escort him to the flight deck immediately." "You will do no such thing," Thorne bellowed. "I am the authority on this deck." Commander Price finally turned his head to face Thorne, and the look in his eyes was like glacial ice. "No, sir," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an absolute, unbreakable authority. "You are not. Not today." A few minutes later, Stanley Morton emerged back into the blinding sunlight, blinking slowly. He looked small and slightly bewildered by the fuss. The crowd parted for him as he was led toward the waiting helicopter. Commander Price strode to meet him. He stopped 3 feet in front of Stanley, drew himself to his full height, and executed the sharpest, most respectful salute Thorne had ever witnessed. It was a salute reserved for heroes and heads of state. "Mr. Morton," Price said, his voice thick with emotion. "Stanley, it is an honor, sir." Stanley, looking taken aback, returned a faint ghost of a salute, a muscle memory from a lifetime ago. Price kept his salute for a moment longer before dropping it. He then turned to face the entire silent audience on the flight deck, the sailors, the families, and the utterly dumbfounded Commander Thorne. "I think everyone here needs to understand who they are in the presence of," Price announced, his voice booming with pride. "This is Stanley the Ghost Morton. In 1968, flying an H-34 Choctaw, a machine with less navigational equipment than your family car. He flew into the heart of a typhoon to rescue the crew of a downed P-3 Orion that command had declared lost. He wasn't ordered to go. He went because he heard the call. He found them in zero visibility, hovering 50 feet over 100-foot waves, using nothing but a magnetic compass and the timing between lightning flashes to navigate. A murmur went through the crowd. Thorne's face had gone from red to a sickly, ashen white. "This man," Price continued, pointing a gloved finger at Stanley, "is credited with 78 combat and civilian rescues. He pioneered nighttime overwater helicopter SAR techniques that are still the foundation of everything we do in my squadron. We are the Night Witches because he was the first warlock. He flew missions that nobody else would, to save men that everyone else had given up on. One of those men was a young naval aviator named Thomas Vance, the father of the current admiral of the Pacific Fleet." The crowd, which had been silent, erupted into spontaneous thunderous applause. The sailors, the families, even the LSOs were clapping, their faces filled with awe. They were looking at Stanley not as an old man but as a giant. Commander Price let the applause die down before he turned his icy gaze back to Thorne. "Commander," he said, his voice dangerously low, "the deck of this ship is sacred ground, consecrated by the service of men like him. Your job is to be its steward, not its tyrant. You will show him the respect he has earned, or I will personally fly you to Pearl Harbor to explain to Admiral Vance why you shouldn't be commanding a desk, let alone an air wing." Thorne was speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. The entire structure of his authority had been dismantled in front of his crew in less than 5 minutes. But before the humiliation could curdle into something uglier, Stanley Morton stepped forward. He placed a gentle, steadying hand on Commander Price's arm. "Son," Stanley said, his quiet voice cutting through the tension, "that's enough. A captain's first duty is to the safety of his ship and his crew." He saw an old man wandering where he shouldn't be. He was doing his job as he saw it. He turned his pale blue eyes to Thorne, and there was no malice in them, only a deep, weary understanding. "The uniform changes, Commander. The technology changes, but the mission doesn't. And the most important part of the mission is the people. The lesson here isn't about salutes or who has more stripes on their sleeve. It's about remembering to look past the surface. See the person, not just the liability. See the history in their eyes, not just the wrinkles around them." As Stanley spoke, his hand instinctively went to his pocket, his fingers finding the familiar shape of the old brass compass. The image flared in his mind again, sharp and clear. He was being lowered on a steel cable, the wind trying to tear him away. Below him, a young pilot, no older than 20, was clinging to a life raft, his eyes wide with terror. The waves crashed over him, stealing his breath. Stanley had landed on the raft, unclipped the compass from his belt, and pressed it into the young man's freezing hand. "This will always point you home," he'd yelled over the storm. "Now let's get you there." The compass wasn't just a tool, it was a promise, a symbol of a creed that you never, ever leave anyone behind. In the aftermath, Commander Price insisted that Stanley join him for a flight in the SH-60. "We'll show you what your legacy has become, sir," he said with a wide grin. Stanley accepted, and as he was helped into the modern marvel of a helicopter, the entire flight deck crew, at an unspoken command, lined the deck and rendered a slow, solemn salute. Commander Thorne was nowhere to be seen. He had been quietly but firmly ordered to the bridge by the ship's captain, who had watched the entire affair unfold from above, and was now preparing a masterclass in naval etiquette for his ambitious air boss. Weeks passed. The official fallout was minimal but significant. No public reprimand for Thorne, but he was quietly reassigned to a shore-based training command. A new mandatory veteran heritage module was introduced for all flight deck officers, using an anonymized version of the incident on the Reagan as its central case study. One Saturday afternoon, in the quiet halls of the San Diego Air and Space Museum, a man in a polo shirt and slacks stood before the restored fuselage of a Sikorsky H-34. It was David Thorne. He looked different without his uniform, smaller, less certain. He was studying the primitive cockpit, the simple dials, trying to comprehend the sheer guts it took to fly such a machine into the dark. He heard a quiet voice nearby and turned. It was Stanley Morton, talking to a small group of children, his gnarled finger pointing to an oil-stained piston. "She was a magnificent machine," Stanley was saying, tricky but honest. "She'd always tell you when she was in trouble, you just had to be willing to listen." Stanley finished his story and the children ran off. His eyes met Thorne's across the polished museum floor. There was no accusation, no lingering anger. Thorne felt a lump form in his throat. He walked over, his steps hesitant. "Sir," Thorne said, the word feeling foreign without the context of rank. "Mr. Morton, I've been reading about the H-34, about your missions." Stanley nodded slowly, a faint, knowing smile gracing his lips. "She had a lot of heart," he said simply, patting the cold metal of the helicopter. "You just had to know where to look." In that quiet moment, surrounded by the ghosts of aviation past, the former commander finally understood. True authority wasn't about the rank on your collar. It was about the history you honored and the legacy you carried forward. It was about learning to listen. If you were moved by Stanley Morton's story, please hit the like button, share this video with someone who respects our nation's heroes, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories of unassuming courage.